Hello, Jefferson Tigers. Mr. Grosso from Sandburg Middle School here with you again. If you do remember, at the beginning of Charlotte's Web, I had the honor of reading you the first two chapters of the book. Thank you, Jefferson PTA. And they've also given me the honor of reading the final chapter, Chapter 22, A Warm Wind to you today. And I'm really happy to do that. I hope you've enjoyed reading the book so far. I find it to be one of those books that's so infinitely rereadable, and every single time I read it, I think I am ready for chapter 21, last day. I think I'm ready, and I'm ready to handle Charlotte's fate, and every single time I'm wrong. It gets me every time. So if you got a little choked up when you got to that part of the book, you're not alone. No worries. Nothing to be ashamed of. It's a very emotional moment. Anyways, without further ado, chapter 22, A Warm Wind. And so Wilbur came home to his beloved manure pile in the barn cellar. His was a strange homecoming. Around his neck he wore a medal of honor. In his mouth he held a sack of spider's eggs. There is no place like home, Wilbur thought, as he placed Charlotte's 514 unborn children carefully in a safe corner. The barn smelled good. His friends, the sheep and the geese, were glad to see him back. The geese gave him a noisy welcome. Congratulations, they cried. Nice work. Mr. Zuckerman took the medal from Wilbur's neck and hung it on a nail over the pig pen, where visitors could examine it. Wilbur himself could look at it whenever he wanted to. In the days that followed, he was very happy. He grew to a great size. He no longer worried about being killed, for he knew that Mr. Zuckerman would keep him as long as he lived. Wilbur often thought of Charlotte. A few strands of her old web still hung in the doorway. Every day Wilbur would stand and look at the torn, empty web, and a lump would come to his throat. No one had ever had such a friend, so affectionate, so loyal, and so skillful. The autumn days grew shorter. Lurvy brought the squashes and pumpkins in from the garden and piled them on the barn floor, where they wouldn't get nipped on frosty nights. The maples and birches turned bright colors, and the wind shook them, and they dropped their leaves one by one to the ground. Under the wild apple trees in the pasture, the red little apples lay thick on the ground, and the sheep gnawed them, and the geese gnawed them, and foxes came in the night and sniffed them. One evening, just before Christmas, snow began falling. It covered house and barn and fields and woods. Wilbur had never seen snow before. When morning came, he went out and plowed the drifts in his yard, for the fun of it. Fern and Avery arrived, dragging a sled. They coasted down the lane and out onto the frozen pond in the pasture. "Coasting is the most fun there is," said Avery. "The most fun there is," retorted Fern, "is when the Ferris wheel stops, and Henry and I are in the top car, and Henry makes the car swerve, and we can see everything for miles and miles and miles." "Goodness, are you still thinking about that old Ferris wheel?" said Avery in disgust. "The fair was weeks and weeks ago." "I think about it all the time," said Fern, picking snow from her ear. After Christmas, the thermometer dropped to 10 below zero. Cold settled on the world. The pasture was bleak and frozen. Whew, it's pretty cold while I'm reading this, so I totally feel that part. The cows stayed in the barn all the time now, except on sunny mornings when they went out and stood in the barnyard in the lee of the straw pile. The sheep stayed near the barn, too, for protection. When they were thirsty, they ate snow. The geese hung around the barnyard the way boys hang around a drugstore, and Mr. Zuckerman fed them corn and turnips to keep them cheerful. "Many, many, many thanks," they always said when they saw food coming. Templeton moved indoors when winter came. His ratty home under the pig trough was too chilly, so he fixed himself a cozy nest in the barn behind the grain bins. He lined it with bits of dirty newspapers and rags, and whenever he found a trinket or a keepsake, he carried it home and stored it there. He continued to visit Wilbur 3 times a day, exactly at mealtime, and Wilbur kept the promise he had made. Wilbur let the rat eat first. Then, when Templeton couldn't hold another mouthful, Wilbur would eat. As a result of overeating, Templeton grew bigger and fatter than any rat you ever saw. He was gigantic. He was as big as a young woodchuck. The old sheep spoke to him about his size one day. "You would live longer," said the old sheep, "if you ate less." "Who wants to live forever?" sneered the rat. "I am naturally a heavy eater, and I get untold satisfaction from the pleasures of the feast." He patted his stomach, grinned at the sheep, and crept upstairs to lie down. All winter, Wilbur watched over Charlotte's egg sack as though he were guarding his own children. He had scooped out a special place in the manure for the sack, next to the board fence. On very cold nights he lay so that his breath would warm it. For Wilbur, nothing in life was so important as this small round object. Nothing else mattered. Patiently he awaited the end of winter and the coming of the little spiders. Life is always a rich and steady time when you are waiting for something to happen or to hatch. The winter ended at last. "I heard the frogs today," said the old sheep one evening. "Listen, you can hear them now." Wilbur stood still and cocked his ears. From the pond, in shrill chorus, came the voices of hundreds of little frogs. "Springtime," said the old sheep, thoughtfully. "Another spring." Oh, it's kind of nice to think about spring right now, isn't it? It's the beginning of February. As she walked away, Wilbur saw a new lamb following her. It was only a few hours old. The snows melted and ran away. The streams and ditches bubbled and chattered with rushing water. A sparrow with a streaky breast arrived and sang. The light strengthened. The mornings came sooner. Almost every morning there was another new lamb in the sheepfold. The goose was sitting on 9 eggs. The sky seemed wider and a warm wind blew. The last remaining strands of Charlotte's old web floated away and vanished. One fine sunny morning, after breakfast, Wilbur stood watching his precious sack. He wasn't thinking of anything much. As he stood there, he noticed something move. He stepped closer and stared. A tiny spider crawled from the sack. It was no bigger than a grain of sand, no bigger than the head of a pin. Its body was gray, with a black stripe underneath. Its legs were gray and tan. It looked just like Charlotte. Wilbur trembled all over when he saw it. The little spider waved at him. Then Wilbur looked more closely. 2 more little spiders crawled out and waved. They climbed round and round on the sack, exploring their new world. Then 3 more little spiders. Then 8. Then 10. Charlotte's children were here at last. Wilbur's heart pounded. He began to squeal. Then he raced in circles, kicking manure into the air. Then he turned a backflip. Then he planted his front feet and came to a stop in front of Charlotte's children. "Hello there," he said. The first spider said hello, but its voice was so small, Wilbur couldn't hear it. "I'm an old friend of your mother's," said Wilbur. "I'm glad to see you. Are you all right? Is everything all right?" The little spiders waved their forelegs at him. Wilbur could see by the way they acted that they were glad to see him. "Is there anything I can get you? Is there anything you need?" The young spiders just waved. For several days and several nights they crawled here and there, up and down, around and about, waving at Wilbur, trailing tiny drag lines behind them, and exploring their home. There were dozens and dozens of them. Wilbur couldn't count them, but he knew that he had a great many new friends. They grew quite rapidly. Soon each was as big as a BB shot. They made tiny webs near the sack. Then came a quiet morning when Mr. Zuckerman opened a door on the north side. A warm draft of rising air blew softly through the barn cellar. The air smelled of the damp earth, of the spruce woods, of the sweet springtime. The baby spiders felt the warm updraft. One spider climbed to the top of the fence. Then it did something that came as a great surprise to Wilbur. The spider stood on its head, pointed its spinnerets in the air, and let loose a cloud of fine silk. The silk formed a balloon. As Wilbur watched, the spider let go of the fence and rose into the air. "Goodbye," it said as it sailed through the doorway. Wait a minute, screamed Wilbur. Where do you think you're going? But the spider was already out of sight. Then another baby spider crawled to the top of the fence, stood on its head, made a balloon, and sailed away. Then another spider. Then another. The air was soon filled with tiny balloons, each balloon carrying a spider. Wilbur was frantic. Charlotte's babies were disappearing at a great rate. "Come back, children," he cried. "Goodbye," they called. "Goodbye, goodbye." At last one little spider took time enough to stop and talk to Wilbur before making its balloon. "We're leaving here on the warm-up draft. This is our moment for setting forth. We are aeronauts, and we are going out into the world to make webs for ourselves." Sorry, that's my best baby spider voice, guys. Hope it's okay. "But where?" asked Wilbur. "Wherever the wind takes us. High, low, near, far, east, west, north, south. We take to the breeze, we go as we please." "Are all of you going?" asked Wilbur. "You can't all go. I would be left alone with no friends. Your mother wouldn't want that to happen, I'm sure." The air was now so full of balloonists that the barn cellar looked almost as though a mist had gathered. Balloons by the dozen were rising, circling, and drifting away through the door, sailing off on the gentle wind. Cries of "Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye" came weakly to Wilbur's ears. He couldn't bear to watch any more. In sorrow, he sank to the ground and closed his eyes. This seemed like the end of the world, to be deserted by Charlotte's children. Wilbur cried himself to sleep. When he woke, it was late afternoon. He looked at the egg sack. It was empty. He looked into the air. The balloonists were gone. Then he walked drearily to the doorway where Charlotte's web used to be. He was standing there thinking of her when he heard a small voice. "Salutations," it said. "I'm up here." "So am I," said another tiny voice. "So am I," said a third voice. "Three of us are staying. We like this place, and we like you." Wilbur looked up. At the top of the doorway, 3 small webs were being constructed. On each web, working busily, was one of Charlotte's daughters. "Can I take this to mean," asked Wilbur, "that you have definitely decided to live here in the barn cellar, and that I'm going to have 3 friends?" "You can indeed," said the spiders. "What are your names, please?" asked Wilbur, trembling with joy. "I'll tell you my name," replied the first little spider, "if you'll tell me why you're trembling." "I'm trembling with joy," said Wilbur. "Then my name is Joy," said the first spider. "What was my mother's middle name?" asked the second spider. "A," said Wilbur. "Then my name is Arania," said the spider. "How about me?" said the third spider. "Will you just pick out a nice sensible name for me? Something not too long, not too fancy, and not too dumb?" Wilbur thought hard. "Nellie?" he suggested. "Fine, I like that very much," said the third spider. "You may call me Nellie." She daintily fastened her oar blind to the next spoke of the web. Wilbur's heart brimmed with happiness. He felt that he should make a short speech on this very important occasion. "Joy, Arania, Nellie," he began, "welcome to the barn cellar. You have chosen a hallowed doorway from which to string your webs. I think it is only fair to tell you that I was devoted to your mother. I owe my very life to her. She was brilliant, beautiful, and loyal to the end. I shall always treasure her memory. To you, her daughters, I pledge my friendship, forever and ever." "I pledge mine," said Joy. "I do too," said Arania. "And so do I," said Nellie, who had just managed to catch a small gnat. It was a happy day for Wilbur, and many more happy, tranquil days followed. As time went on, and the months and years came and went, he was never without friends. Fern did not come regularly to the barn anymore. She was growing up and was careful to avoid childish things, like sitting on a milk stool near a pig pen. But Charlotte's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, year after year, lived in the doorway. Each spring there were new little spiders hatching out to take the place of the old. Most of them sailed away on their balloons, but always 2 or 3 stayed and set up housekeeping in the doorway. Mr. Zuckerman took fine care of Wilbur all the rest of his days, and the pig was often visited by friends and admirers, for nobody ever forgot the year of his triumph in the miracle of the web. Life in the barn was very good, night and day, winter and summer, spring and fall, dull days and bright days. It was the best place to be, thought Wilbur, this warm, delicious cellar, with the garrulous geese, the changing seasons, the heat of the sun, the passage of swallows, the nearness of rats, the sameness of sheep, the love of spiders, the smell of manure, and the glory of everything. Wilbur never forgot Charlotte. Although he loved her children and grandchildren dearly, none of the new spiders ever quite took her place in his heart. She was in a class by herself. It is not often that someone comes along who is a true friend and a good writer. Charlotte was both. The end. Wow, that's a really good conclusion to a book, in my opinion. I like this little illustration on the end. So some things that I like to think about whenever I'm done with a book is obviously, do I like the ending or not? Did I like it? Did it feel, and if I do like it, why? Did it feel satisfying? Did it make me feel a good way? Some books have great endings because they make you feel good, and some books have great endings because they make you feel sad, or sometimes they might even make you feel, a little confused, but it gives you something very cool to think about. Some endings of books make you mad, and it really frustrates you. And sometimes they make you mad, but you know what? It was the right ending to it. But that doesn't mean I have to like that it's the right ending. That's the case. And sometimes when I read books and I'm done with them, I think a lot about what I would have done with the book. I think about, parts in the book that I thought were pretty interesting, but maybe I'm like, maybe it should have happened this way, or maybe the end could have used one more chapter that explains this. And that's something where I always kind of throw it to students. When I used to do reading and read alouds at Jefferson. I'm a math teacher now. I don't do them quite so much, except I do them with math books, but that's a little different. When you're done with a read aloud, there's a lot of places to go with your thoughts, and there's a lot of things to think about, like how you would have written it. And when people ask me where I get the ideas for my books, my answer is always, I don't really know where they come from, but I do know that I have a good idea when I think of something that's a book that I wish existed. Or like if I finish reading a book, maybe it's Charlotte's Web, maybe it's something else, and I think, here's something else I would have added to the ending, or I might have gone this direction. Well, that's where you find your ideas. Your ideas come from the things that you could uniquely put in the world. What's the book that only you could write? Because E.B. White is the only person who could have written Charlotte's Web. Someone else could have written a book about a pig named Wilbur, or could have written about a spider named Charlotte, but this story only would have come from E.B. White. And so I think whenever I'm done with a book, I ask myself, well, what book do I feel like I want to write? What sort of story do I feel like I want to tell after reading that? And sometimes it's a version of a book with a different ending, like maybe one where Charlotte lives, or maybe one where, more than 3 of the spiders stay with Wilbur in the end. Or maybe there's another story with those 3 spiders. One of them has something else they do with Wilbur that needs to be told. But that's kind of where I like to go whenever I'm done with something. Other than that, I hope you guys really enjoyed Charlotte's Web. If you'd seen the movie before, I hope you saw some other different insights into the story by reading the book version of it. If you've read it before, I hope, like me, you got something else out of it, and maybe you managed not to get so choked up in that one chapter. We all know which one I'm talking about. And if you'd never read it before, or you'd never seen the movie, you had no idea what the story is, I hope it was a nice, pleasant surprise for you. And if it wasn't, if there was something about it you're like, it was okay, but I'd prefer a book more like this. Well, my challenge to you is you try writing that story. Go ahead. What's that story that Charlotte's Web wasn't that you think needs to be out there? See if you can come up with that story and write a little bit about it. Because I'll tell you one thing, whether you're a writer or not, whether you feel like you're a reader or not, if you have the right story to read, or if you have the right story you want to write, anyone can become a writer or reader. Anyone. So Thank you so much, Jefferson Tigers. Say another hello and I miss you to your 4th and 5th grade teachers and anybody who you're with there. It's really wonderful staff you have there. And thank you so much to the PTA for inviting me into classrooms to do this. Thanks.